AI coders are all the rage right now. Literally, my YouTube is filled with dozens of thumbnails talking just about Cursor or Windsor. Now, to be honest, I'm really interested. I really want to see if Cursor can really boost my productivity more than GitHub Copilot, which I've been using for almost a year now. But trivial examples are not gonna quench my curiosity. I want to see Cursor work on a real world project, because that's what I do. So let's see if Cursor can be helpful for a senior engineer. Oh yeah, I am a senior engineer. Shut up. I do all of these crazy experiments live on my stream every Tuesday on YouTube. I hope to see you there next time. We're gonna test out the entire life cycle of a software engineer. Right from onboarding into a new project, which you have absolutely no clue about, to building smallish foot in the door kind of features, some stuff to just, get you started, and all the way to some massive features which would take like a lot of consideration. So the first thing is Cursor does come with a price tag of $20. Compared to Copilot, which I've been using for free, that's quite a step up. So I want to see if it's worth it. Starting with the most important thing, the GitHub project. It's completely open source. You can check out the code if you want. What we're going to do is we're going to build a model gateway. What do we mean by a model gateway? Let me just show you. So normally when you're talking to any tool, whenever you're using a large language model, right? Under the hood, you're using an SDK, but it's making an API call like this one. So you have a model. In my case, it's Llama 3.1. And essentially what you're doing is you're hard coding the model name here, and then you get a response. However, it works till the next model comes out. Because the moment Llama, 3.3 comes out, you might want to change the model, which means you have to go in your code base and change it everywhere. Now, you can configure these things to environment variables and stuff like that, but it's just annoying. Wouldn't it be better if you had like a server which understood that based on who is making the request to dynamically use the right model? So your model, instead of, hard coding the model name like Llama 3.1, you would hard code a name like small or medium, just that, and let the server or the gateway decide which model to actually use. That's essentially what this project is. Again, it's a hobby project, very straightforward. Now I know what you're thinking. This is just an API gateway. This is like the easiest project, like the hello world of API gateways. It's pretty straightforward, I'll give you that. In terms of logic, it's really easy to understand what this tool is and what is it doing. But there are some interesting pieces here. But yeah, let's talk about the architecture. I'd be a devil's advocate is that the best way to know if Cursor works for you is to try it out on your own project. Absolutely. I mean, I don't even think that's devil's advocate. That's just facts, my friend. Absolutely agree. Okay, so why is this a complex project enough? Why did I use this project as my bar of success or failure? Because functionality is simple, so you guys will be able to follow it. However, there are some interesting things going on here. Like I said, this is a hobby project. Usually I implement some new concept which I've been working on in such projects. So let me show you a couple of them. I'll be showing you two important concepts which are not broadly implemented. At least I guess they aren't, but they're really interesting, and it would be really interesting to see if Cursor can follow along with this, because this is something I've come up with. At least I think I've come up with. So let's look at it. So the first thing is, let's go back to Hopscotch. How do you configure this service? For example, I have been configuring these models and things like that, right? So there are config APIs. So there are APIs to, like, for example, get all the backends. And let's just run the server. Okay. So there are config APIs. So everything is configurable. So essentially, this is like the very basic version. You can configure what backends you have. So like you can configure an Ollama backend, which is basically an inference server, right? OpenAI would be a backend, and all these different Gemini, your custom OpenAI compatible server. These are all backends, right? These are servers which actually run AI, or hopefully are running AI. So you have to configure backends. Then you configure models, which is, okay, I have like Llama 3.1 in here, and I even have like another embedding model in here, and these models are mapped to a respective backend. So models are mapped to backends, and of course there are some API keys as well. So I can configure API keys like how you would do with OpenAI Playground and things like that, right? Now the interesting thing is, so I have like a config endpoint, adding a backend, deleting a backend, getting a backend, and for every object you see. So every resource which is available, like we have backends, models, and API keys, each resource will have its own post API, which is to create and update. It will have its delete API, and it will have a get API, right? Fairly straightforward. The interesting thing what I have done is none of the modules. So these are organized as modules. So the LLM module is everything to do with the LLMs or the actual inference servers on the back. and security is everything to do with API keys and things like that. None of the modules implement the config APIs. So if you look at my routes, you'll never see a route called add model or add backend. So how is that being configured? So the truth is, I am a lazy dev and I wanted to do it dynamically. I wanted to generate all config endpoints dynamically. The way I did it was I implemented this function called get resources info. So every module will have to implement this function. And essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying that, okay, I've got 2 resources here. By the way, the project is in Golang project. I did not choose something in JavaScript and Python because I think AI is trained heavily on those 2 languages. I wanted to use something which is a little different. And I think Go is like a good middle ground between a functional language and a not super popular language, right? So, okay, over here, I have 2 backends as 2 resources. The first one is backends, the second one is models. And each resource exposes a config object. This is the schema of the config. In Go, you have structures, so it's like classes. Think of a pydantic class, right? If you're coming from the Python world. So I've got like the ID field, and you can see that I've already got some validation stuff going on here. Like I've validated required, as in the ID field is required. I have a backend type, again required. I have a config object. I have options, blah, 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 blah. So there's a schema. Now I have a schema and I know exactly what resources there are. So in my code, somewhere in my code, I essentially go ahead and list all my modules. For every module, I create these routes. So I list over all the resources in that module. And you see here, I'm creating a post route, I'm creating a getter route, and I'm creating a delete route. And obviously, if you look at just the post route, I'm using that validate annotations, which you saw earlier, to make sure that the body I'm getting in my response is indeed following the specs defined in that module. So this way, as I keep adding new and new modules and new features to my server or my application, I do not have to create config APIs for each one of them, because I was just doing it was just a lot of boilerplate code at that point, and I wanted to completely automate it. All I have to do whenever I want to add a new resource object is, like I said, add an object right here. And the service dynamically gives me a JSON object which will follow that schema. So I'll get a JSON object which will obviously have that backends and those models like you see right here. Already a little interesting. APIs are being done dynamically. What's important is that if you look at the API file once again, it's fine if you cannot read the code. It's completely all right. But the point is, all of these are interfaces. Nowhere in my API code or in my API controller or API handler, I don't know what you call it. Nowhere in my API handlers or API controllers will there be any reference of the LLM module or the API keys module or anything of that sort, because this is all polymorphism. So even if I control click it, I have no way to go to the actual function implementing it, which is crazy if you think about it. Like, how do you navigate this? A lot of people who worked with me in the past, especially people new to coding and new to just this form of coding, things are so dynamic, they just cannot navigate the code base. Like, how do you navigate this? Control click doesn't work. That's like the best thing we always do, right? But that's not it. I want to show you one more complication in this config API fields. Let's go back to hopscotch. API keys. So we have some API keys right here. Okay, so I can add a new key. So let's say I'm adding a new key, right? It's just a config object which just needs an ID field. I think it also takes a description, but who cares? We just care about the ID field. Oh, this is the response. My bad. Yeah, my bad. This is the request. Yes, we need the description. Yep, there we go. Let's say I want to create a new API key. So I'm just creating a new API key with this new ID and I'm creating it. Now see what I get in the response. I actually got an API key which I can shove in the header, even though that's not something I passed in my request body. So there's some dynamic logic going on here. But remember, our handlers were automated. All API handlers for config were being created dynamically, but there's still some custom logic going on here. So what is happening? But not just that. If I update it, like if I want to change the description to something else, now I don't get the API key. So the logic is different for creating objects and updating objects. What makes it even crazier is if I get this, it's not even the same fields anymore. The key is nowhere to be found. That's like the first thing. We're only getting the last few digits. And I'm actually going to go ahead and tell you that the key which we got in that result, it's not stored in the database. We're storing a hash value instead. Because, storing keys and passwords in database, you shouldn't do that. Please don't do that. Do you see what's happening here, right? We have custom logic for creating, updating, and getting things. So how is that working? Now, this is the second piece of interesting stuff. The way that has been implemented is the same config object which, we were creating earlier. Like again, where we had the validation stuff. You can optionally implement some methods. So here, for example, I've implemented a provision method. It's like a hook. So whenever this resource was being created, it can implement a provision method. So this method gets invoked. And here I generate the key and I return it, right? And I'm just storing the hash. So the main object doesn't get the key. It just gets the hash and the key is being returned in the response body. Similarly for update, because it's an update, I don't generate the key again. I just update some values and I'm pretty much good to go. Now, the router was smart enough to see that if that resource which is being created implemented that method, then we invoke that method. If not, we just go through. So this way, every resource, every module has the scope of implementing its own custom logic of creating, created, and destroyed. This is as complex as it gets. I mean, it's not the most complex thing. I think people should be able to follow along. But are you able to follow along? Are you guys with me? I mean, can Cursor keep up with this? I'm really skeptical because every time, like I said, if I control click anything, it will never show me the API keys. That's crazy. Okay, so are you trying to re-implement what you wrote by hand and trying to write it in Cursor? No. We're not going to rewrite this entire project in Cursor. That's going to be insane. We're going to use what I have right now as the base to build on top of. So we already have some boilerplate in place, which is complex to navigate. It is complex to onboard into. And we want to see if Cursor can make that experience easier. Can Cursor make onboarding into an existing project easier? Can Cursor help me get started with simple bug fixes in a complex code base? And can Cursor help me implement heavy lifting features which require multiple updates throughout? Because that's when I'll really be like, okay, Cursor, you're worth it. I mean, if Cursor can work on this code base, dude, I would be ecstatic. So that's our starting point. That's feature number one, dynamic config endpoints. Not just dynamic config endpoints, but some weird polymorphic shit wherein if the resources implemented some methods, then they can add custom functionality to the API endpoint. It's already pretty complex, but to add to it, there's just one slight layer of complexity. The reason why I started to make this was none of the model gateways which I saw in the open source territory were multi-tenant. I wanted something multi-tenant. I really am fascinated by multi-tenant SaaS apps. And I've been doing a lot of research there. So, one important point. Now, I know what you guys are thinking. Dude, you're just making a model gateway. Did you really have to do all of this? And to that I say, I did not. It's a hobby project and I really enjoy making such things. So you have to bear with me, okay? But we got a complex project we can work with. Sweet. This is all the explanation y'all needed. These are the two important things y'all need to know about because, and I'm giving you this upfront, like most people onboarding into the project, they won't even have this context. And this is the context with which Cursor has to deal with. This is the lay of the land. Can Cursor figure out what the hell is going on here? Okay, cool. Let's start this. A couple of things when we start. Please use Composer and not Chat. We're going to use both, Prashant. We're going to use both. I think both have their own merit. I think both are really important and we'll see when to use what. We'll see what feature of Cursor to use what. I think that's important because Cursor has given a lot of things and I've done a lot of research. So there are couple of things which I've understood, my research alone. Did not get to try out a lot of things on this project. I've tried it in some simpler projects. So a couple of things with Cursor you just need to keep in mind is first, Cursor is not an engineer. You are the engineer. You're responsible to make the plans. You're responsible to know what needs to be done at the end of the day. Cursor is not gonna do things for you when you don't know what needs to be done. Keep that in mind. I think that's important to remember. I think a lot of people say that, with Cursor and Windsurf and I don't know about Devin, I still need to check it out, but with at least the Cursors and Windsurfs of the world, people think that, you know what, I don't need to hire engineers and stuff. But based on what I've seen, you still need to have the mindset. You still need to have a developer mindset. Keep that in mind, okay? And of course, we are going to keep the dev mindset on. Developer mindset, we'll definitely have a plan to answer each question, which we're going to see. And most importantly, we're going to use something called a Cursor rules file. So let's start over there. Before getting into Cursor directly, I think one thing is really important, which is the Cursor rules file. This is the system prompt of Cursor. That's what I understand. The thing is, your code could be really difficult to follow, and just throwing AI at it would not be fair. Let's say it's not going to be fair. What Cursor has come up with is that you can tell Cursor, like you can give it a little bit of information about what your project is and how is it going to be arranged and things like that. So I've already done that. That's called the Cursor rules file. If you go to the Cursor directory, okay, if you go to the Cursor directory, cursor.directory, let me put that in chat. This is amazing rules files. I'm just going to call it system prompts. These are some amazing system prompts which people have written for different languages. I have a strong feeling that people are going to have preference for TypeScript and Next.js and things like that, like the front end stack. Maybe that's why AI is doomed. Everybody's just using it for front end, and front end is not like the best code out there, right? Right? I'm just kidding. Please don't boycott me. Yeah, okay, so the best prompts I've seen actually come from the Next.js world. So if you go to Next.js and you can just open up, you can see that, okay, people have written their prompts. So you're a senior front-end engineer and expert in React.js, blah, blah, blah. So it's introducing what the tech stack is. It's putting in some important things like, don't put to-dos, fully implement all required functionality, blah, blah, blah. They're including their tech stack. I think that's really important. Cursor would never know what are the tools that you're using, what are the libraries that you're using. And if you're using something which is not the de facto one, like you have this weird charting library which you found on some corner of the internet, make sure you include that. Please include that. Let Cursor know about it. And you can even put in some linting rules and things like that right here. We'll talk about linting soon. I mean, there's some crazy stuff which Cursor does for linting. Oh my god, we'll get to it. Now the problem is, if you're not from the TypeScript ecosystem, you're not gonna get a good prompt. So for example, I'm using Go. So somebody has written one prompt for Go, but it doesn't look as well formatted as the Next.js one. So what did I do? I simply copied this over and I opened my best friend, my overlord, my savior, ChatGPT. And I go ahead and say like, hey, I want to write a Cursor rules file for my application. The file should make it explicitly clear my project is about. Here's a Golang sample file I really liked. And then I paste the Golang prompt here. For reference, use the formatting done by this Next.js prompt. Because the Next.js prompt was actually really good. Remember, most of these tools are going to be used by early adopters, and it happens to be people who just want to build like apps really quick, like the to-do apps of the world. And it's in React and Next.js. It happens to be, which is not a bad thing, I guess. Not a bad thing at all. Next.js. Let's copy this. Remember, I am using Go. And I'm also going to mention some of my libraries. Like, I just make ChatGPT do all my work. So I'm going to be like, I use Gochi for routing, libsql for database, I don't know, and whatever your libraries are, it doesn't really matter. And ChatGPT will actually give you a really good output, which you can straight up use. Actually, you know what? Let's not use this. Let me copy this again. A better way to use ChatGPT is use this Canvas, man. Canvas is an amazing feature. It's a little buggy on the desktop app, I'm not gonna lie, but it lets you like collaboratively work on documents alongside with ChatGPT. So for one-off docs, it's really good. So this is like the document. You can literally make edits on this document directly because not every edit by AI is perfect. And you can like cover explicit parts of the library and just ask ChatGPT to make changes to that. So if you don't know what the Canvas feature of ChatGPT is, I mean, now you know. It's amazing. Want to make text files or like make function pieces of code, snippets, stuff like that? I use Canvas all the time. I mean, I just love it. Cool. So you could just copy it over, put it in your Cursor IDE. I've already done for myself. And you can see that, I've also gone ahead and added a little bit of structure. So a server is everything related to server and workspace management. Modules is all the modules which get loaded as a part of the workspace. And utils are utility functions. Blah, 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 blah. And it's pretty good. Nothing too bad. Nothing too shabby. I think it's pretty good. So start with the Cursor rules file. Trust me, huge difference. Crazy ass difference. How do you know that the Cursor rule file actually works? So whenever I add this file, sometimes it's not really apparent, especially if you're new with this tooling like me, if you're like a complete noob. You don't know if this file is actually getting read. So what I ended up doing, okay, don't laugh at me. So what I ended up doing was start every response with ho, ho, ho. Merry Christmas, guys. Merry Christmas. So now if you open the chat console and if you say Can you help me? If it started with the ho ho ho, meaning your cursor rule file is getting detected. That's a good thing, okay? So things work. Sweet. Now let's get into the real business. We spend too much time messing around with things which are not important. We haven't really explored and dived deep into cursor. That is not cool. And I apologize for that. Oh, there's a question. Is the cursor rules file going to be project specific? Yes, it is project specific. For open-ended Python projects, I just specified global system prompt under settings. Yes, you can do that as well. That's a very good point. Thank you so much for bringing that up. So the cursor rules files is for project specific things. But if you want to put something a little bit more generic, you can put rule file directly in the cursor settings as well. This is going to be on all chats. I don't know if this is global or is this project specific. I have no clue. But I really like to put a rules files in because I like to tell it about my project. I think that makes a huge difference, like giving it the structure of your files and stuff, especially for bigger projects. I think it's better. Oh, okay. So this one is global. Sure. So you could have global stuff as well, which is going to be applied for everything, but you could also have this. So I'm assuming they both get appended or something of that sort. Personal preference. If you have something generic, put in the global thing. If you're like me and you want it customized for every project, you're going to have a cursor rules file. Let's start with the first thing, onboarding into this project. So we went through a lot of stuff. The question we should start with is, let's see if AI really understands and is AI able to navigate this code base. Can we get the primary sidebar out? We're using chat, and let's ask it to explain us how the API key feature works, right? Now here's the tricky part in this. Remember I said I'm using a lot of polymorphism. I want to see which even the control clicks cannot use. Okay, that was interesting. Control clicks cannot navigate this code base. Will cursor be able to navigate it? Would it be able to understand that, okay, there are some API routes written in the server file which indirectly call your config APIs and things like that? I mean, let's see if it can navigate this code base and talk about the entire flow. Let's just run this. First, we're gonna go with Sonnet again. So I'm using the chat feature. It's reading some files. Got the API key file. That's important. It got all the stuff in security, which is good. Security is the important stuff. It also seems to have gotten some of the workspace files. I am not sure if that's helpful or not. Doesn't matter. Let's just see what it's doing. Started straight up with the API key structure, which is perfect. So it literally figured out that, okay, this is the API key structure. That's good. Explaining that. Okay, that looks good. API key creation flow. This is interesting. When a new API key is created, it goes through the provision method. That is technically correct, but who calls the provision method? Okay, so it's saying that, okay, provision method, that's good. And then within the provision method, we are calling the generate API key. Great. Okay, that's good. And that's my function. Fair enough. This is the easy part. I would assume anybody can do that. It's saying, how do I generate the keys? Then the key is stored in the database. Ooh, the key is technically not being stored in the database. And then when the validation comes in, there's an initialize middleware. Okay, this is technically right. It goes to the validate method. It's even getting all the hooks right. It even figured out I'm using bcrypt for hashing. Now, that is interesting. Nowhere in the code have I mentioned that I'm using bcrypt. Because again, bcrypt is behind an interface. So there's no control click to the bcrypt file. It figured out that I'm using bcrypt. That's interesting. The API key format. The actual sensitive part is only stored as a bcrypt hash in the database. It got it right. Okay, wait. I want to ask a follow-up question. Who is calling the provision and update methods? So it seems to figure out that, okay, there's a function called get resources info, which is good. So because this is what returns what resources are there, right? And then it figured out that in the router file, I am checking if that resource implements the resource provisioner, which is basically, does it have the provision method? And if it has the provision method, you call it. It figured out the right HTTP endpoint. It also figured out the update part. Okay. It figured out the APIs as well. Oh my God, this is right. Wow. It successfully followed along with all polymorphic routes. So finally, it says that, okay, when you do worker.start, that initialize the router for every workspace, which is technically correct. Yep, I initialize the router here. And inside initialize router, I'm doing this code. Wait, what? I don't have a function with this name. I'm 100% certain that I don't have a function with this name. Let's search for this. Let's do a quick Control-C. I'm sorry, my key bindings are not working, so we'll have to do it the hard way. I don't have this function anywhere in our workspace. I have no idea where it got this. I mean, it got the function right. Initialize router is precisely where all of this is happening. but I am not sure where it's getting function names. It's even getting the APIs right. Oh no, the APIs are wrong as well. The tenant and workspace are not in the route. It's making this up. Okay, I think it had a good start, but it started making things up. Like, I am surprised it found bcrypt. And technically speaking, it even figured out that, I'm using the resource provisioner. So it figured out all the parts where we're using polymorphism. So it figured out that the API is calling this interface, and our API keys object is implementing that interface. So they kind of related, which is right. It figured that out, and it could have messed that part up in 100 different ways. I'm really impressed with what it just managed to do. It's crazy. It figured out all the routes. That's insane. But yeah, it messed up with the API routes. Oh wait, a lot of things have just come up in chat. It seems like you've gotten confused. It seems to have. Okay. It seems to have gotten confused between analyzing the code and generating it. See, that's the point. Chat is not about generating, as far as I know, because I just said explain it to me. I never said generate some code. I don't know where did it get it wrong. It started off really solid, but it got it wrong somewhere. I think it started off really well. I think it figured out my polymorphic, assertions and things like that. Kudos, because a lot of people get that wrong. But I think at the API section, it just got it wrong. What if we start a new chat? If I just say codebase, because I don't want to give it the exact file. All right. So what if I say that where are routes getting registered and where are the structs that get populated by the request body? And right now, just so that the Nintendo 504, you know what? I have a Switch. I love my Switch. Whenever I read the word Nintendo, I just think about my Switch straight up. So you're just making me want to play some Pokemon at this point. If Cursor can help us onboard into a new project, right? That's what we're trying to figure out. So it goes to the router again. This is the workspaces part. Yeah, I didn't mention that I wanted config routers. So fair enough. This is on me. Where is it getting this code? Okay, you know what? Some of these are right. I think when we try to do more specific pinpointed questions, I think Cursor is able to do a much better job. But if we try to ask questions which goes across code bases, like across different modules and different files in the code bases, Cursor really struggles in where attention needs to be paid. And that's a difficult problem, to be honest. It is a difficult problem. I'm gonna give it that. You know what? You did a good job. Thank you, Cursor. Thank you for the kind words. Wait, what? I'd encourage you to check out YourTechBud codes on YouTube. What? Guys? Did Cursor just... You need to subscribe now. Guys, subscribe to my YouTube channel. What are you guys doing it? Cursor is plugging me in right now. That's how infectious it's become. I'm convinced that it's hallucinating code that it's seen based on these questions. The chat prompt you use doesn't keep it grounded enough. That's true. The chat prompt which I'm using is not detailed enough to get into it. But I suspect most people will be using it that way. So I have got some interesting features which I want to implement. Okay. Now, ideally, I could have just spent some weekend, like a weekend or two on this and hashed out some code and have gotten it done for myself. But I don't want to do that. So let's see if Cursor can help me. So the first feature was the API keys, which we saw earlier. API keys, when it generates a new key, it's simply hashing the key. It's not doing some dynamic salting. Now, to be fair, bcrypt is an algorithm which does salting by itself. It adds a little bit of salt by itself. But let's assume, just for giggles, let's try to implement salting as well. So right now we are just generating an API key out of the blue, just like that. But I don't want to just do that. Instead, I also want to implement salting. Okay, not too big a change, fairly simple. All you need to do is figure out that, okay, API key provision is where the key gets generated. And we saw that Cursor already helps you find that part. And then all you need to do is update a little bit of code to create a salt as well. So over here, instead of just creating a random string, also create like a salt and then hash using the string and the salt. But the interesting thing here would be you cannot just add the salting part to the generation. You also have to use the salt during validation. Most people who implement this feature forget the validation side. Okay, most people forget the validation side. Let's see if Cursor is better than most people. Yeah, most of these examples are coming from another project which I've worked on, which is open source Firebase, and we face these problems, right? And a lot of senior devs kind of sometimes just miss it. They just miss it unless you have a story which documents all of that. So cool. Let's look at Cursor. So we're gonna use Composer for this one. I'm gonna use the agent because this is like the new agentic coder Cursor introduced. Because Windsurf kind of did that, and Cursor was like, wait a minute, I'm gonna do that as well. So let's see if it works, right? We have a module which creates API keys. It already hashes the key. It already hashes the key before storing it in the database. Now I want to add a random 6-byte salt. Let's do a 6-byte salt. Make sure to store the salt in the database. Now I have intentionally not mentioned anything on the validation side. Should I include some context, or should we try to let Cursor figure it out by itself? I think I can include the current file at the very least, right? Let's put in this helper. So it's security helpers. Cool. So I'm just including the helpers file. That's fine. But I'm not going to mention anything about validation. Okay, I'm actually curious to see because it has to change a lot of things. It will have to change the validation side, the creation side, might even have to change a little bit on the hashing. But let's see. Let's see how it goes. You're trying to be polite to the prompt engineers out there. We have no prompt engineers on this stream. I mean, based on how this stream is going, I think it's way too technical. I think the project is a little bit too intense. I'll help you modify the code to add salt to the API key hashing mechanism. First, let me understand the current code structure. Good job. Good boy. Just for this, extra points. Extra points just for this. So it's reading that file. I'll modify the code to add a 6-byte salt to the hashing mechanism. We'll need to generate a random 6-byte salt. Modify the generate API key function. You know what? I want to get rid of this. Yeah. Modify the generate API key function to generate the salt. That's right. Because remember, that's the function where the API key was getting generated. Update the validation logic. Holy moly. Extra points to Gryffindor just for that. Oh my god, that's good. Good job. Good. So here's the implementation. Okay, can you just show me the implementation? Is there an easier way to go through this code? It's showing me the entire file, but it doesn't seem to have changed anything. Okay, I can see it here. Okay, cool. It has updated this function a little bit, and it's returning the salt as well, which is a good thing because this function it's a stateless function. So it's not storing things in the database. So if it's generating a salt, it will have to return it. So I think it created its new function called generate salt, which is fine. Generating the salt, and then it's creating a salted key. So it's taking that random string and appending the salt to it. So it's adding the salt as a suffix to the key, which is fine. I mean, if you're using an algorithm like bcrypt, it doesn't really matter where you add the salt. Like I said, bcrypt already has salting, so you don't really have to do it yourself. And then it's saying that, okay, hash value. So it's hashing the salted key now. Fair enough. Okay, I'll give it that. And in the validate function, yeah, this is interesting. So here we're getting the API key. This is the raw. We're getting the key back. But now it's taking the key and adding the salt to it. And where did it get this salt? It's getting the salt from the API key object. This API key object, by the way, is what gets stored in the database. So if that object has the hash value somehow, then you can use it anywhere because the code has been written in a way that, okay, whatever you put in the API key will automatically go inside the database. And whenever you retrieve that object, you'll always get it from the database, right? So you don't have to worry about database logic. That's just how the code has been written. So that's a good call. You know, you can just use the hash. Fair enough. And it's using the salted key to compare. I think that looks good. This looks good so far. I'm not going to accept it just yet. I'm just going to proceed and see what else did it do. So it created a generate salt, which I have no idea where did it create it. Where did it create it? Oh, it's right here. Oh, I don't like this. I don't like this. I'll tell you why I don't like this. I don't like this because I already have a generate random string and it's the function I want to use. Why are you creating like another function to do the same thing? I mean, literally, you just had to copy this and then return an additional value, updated, validate, cool, storing salt. I don't like this change at all. Because first, it is using the value from the config object. It never stored it inside the config object. I don't want to do multiple short prompting. I don't want to do multiple short. You know, I think I made a mistake. I think adding this file restricted what changes this does. You know what? Let's retry. I think we restricted it to make changes just to one file, which is wrong. So we're gonna try doing it again. I'm gonna remove that context and I'm gonna make sure I'm on agent. So if I don't add context, will it be able to identify the context by itself? I know, Prashant, what you're saying that, yeah, you can just prompt it extra and then, you know, get it done with. Cursor should have multi-file editing capability, right? Let's see if it works. I want to see that in action. Like, I want to see if it can get it right in one shot. So let's see what it's doing here. So it read the helpers file, it figured out the hash file. Those are right. Yes. This is the fun part. If you're using a typed language, and I've seen this in my other project which I was using it with, if you're using a typed language and cursor generates some code, and let's say it thinks it's done, but what's gonna happen is because it's a typed language and you change one function in one place, it's gonna figure out there's a linter complaining somewhere, so my work is not done yet and I need to continue. So I think it changed certain things, like it created a new function called hash with salt, right, in my interface, but bcrypt has to implement that function because bcrypt was implementing that interface. So that prompted it to continue and add those functions. Like, see, it created that generate salt. I don't like it, but it implemented the hash with salt, which is interesting. So it's taking the whole, yep, looks good, and then compare with salt as well. Okay, that's good. So wait, what did it do exactly? Let's go to this file first. It first went ahead and modified my hasher, and it said I want to add a new mechanism which is saying hash with salt, compare with salt, and generate salt. Sure, cool, 2 new functions. I'm not sure why generate salt is here, but sure, fair enough. And then it goes ahead and it updates the bcrypt file. So it goes to the bcrypt file, it implemented those functions for us. So it implemented generate salt, hash with salt, and compare with salt. Okay, I like it already. And then we go ahead and update the config file, this one. And what it's doing now is it modified the generate API key function so that it returns the salt as well. And there we go. It's storing the salt now, which is important because if you store any value to the API key over here, it will get persisted in the database. I'm not sure if it figured that out automatically, but I mean, it's right. You store any value over here, it gets persisted to the database so that you can use it during the validation phase. And then it's saying that, hey, I updated the hasher, I implemented the bcrypt struct, I modified the generate API key. We did see that. Oh, there you go. So yeah, it's returning our salt, and then it's using the default hasher to generate the salt. Again, I don't think so. This should have been a part of the generate salt. I mean, this shouldn't have been part of the hasher. You could just use the utils. You know, we'll try to iteratively get it right. And then it says hash value hash with salt instead. So did it remove my previous one? Yep, it replaced it. That's good. And in the validation stage, it's decoding the salt. Did it encode the salt while storing it? It encoded the salt while storing it, which is a good thing. And while retrieving it, it remembered to decode it. I mean, I'm impressed. I like it. I like it so far. And then it's just using the default hasher to compare with salt. This should compile and work out of the box. Should we try it? Let's try it. Whenever you're using a tool like Cursor, make sure you like commit every moment. Like if you're using the composer, you want to make sure that you're working from a clean git history, like a clean branch, so that if you want to undo something, I mean, you can just do a git reset. Please do that. Let's see if it builds. It does build. Now, if I open my hopscotch and if I try to run my simple prompt, it should fail because remember, because the salt is just going to be empty. It works. It worked. Let's generate a new key. Let's generate a new key. Add a key. I'm going to make it a key 3. Generate that key. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy it. I'm just going to copy it because I want to use my original key, right? I don't want to take this code. But now if I do get keys, okay, things look just normal. It looks just fine. If I go over to my prompt again and I set this myself, yep, the new key still works. The new key actually works. But how do we know we are actually using the hash? That's a good question. I think what we can do is we can use SQL Server. SQL Studio, was it? Yep, API key right here. Oh, there you go. The salt is right here. It worked. It got it right in one shot. I mean, it's not the best code, but it did get it right in one shot. That's crazy. That is crazy. Oh my God, I can't believe it just got it right. Just like that. Multi-shot prompting is basically how you'd brainstorm with a colleague, in my opinion. That's true. That is true. You know what? I've accepted all the changes, but we can still keep going. Let's say that, hey, do not create a generate salt method in the hasher. Instead, use the utils.generate a random password, random string. I don't know what the function was. It doesn't matter. To create the salt instead. It should be able to fix this, right? This is like a simple fix. Okay, so it removed it from the interface. Good boy. Like you already. And then it removed it from bcrypt as well. Thank you. No linter errors. It checks for linter errors like every step of the way. That's crazy. And then it's going ahead and in this helpers.go. I don't know why this doesn't work. Why can't you just open the file for me, man? Okay, here it's generating it using my function now. Perfect. And the rest is the same. Bingo. That's awesome. I can't believe it. Cursor took this fairly trivial problem. It literally did it without me having to write a single line of code. And technically, I mean, we are on stream, so we took a little bit longer. But if I was doing this myself, itself, I would have taken at least an hour. I mean, just getting up, making sure that I have to write code and stuff like that. Dude, it takes time to just get out of that, get that activation energy to get in. I'm really impressed. Even if Cursor can help me for such trivial use cases and it can just write the code without me having to anything, dude, I think it's a win. It's a W. We're not ending here, of course. We're gonna go deeper and we're gonna see some more difficult problems. Obviously, we are definitely not ending here. Guys, we're not gonna go this easy on Cursor. We are gonna go deeper. But I think this is a big W. I still can't believe it. AI has come a long way. Oh my god. I can't imagine using GitHub Copilot for all this time while Cursor could do these things. I mean, you have to appreciate where I'm coming from. Like, if you're a sole maintainer of a project, if you're doing a hobby project, I think the Nintendo guy, Nintendo 504, you're making a project as well, right? I think you're a sole developer as well. So there are so many things that you have to do, just like chores. And if Cursor can just do them for you and all you have to do is just review their code, like what I did, that's a lot of time saved. That's a lot of mental power saved. Because every line of code you write, I think brings some, right? It just adds a little bit of stress or strain on your brain. I think it's great. I love it. I love the fact that it checks for lints at every step. I swear, when I saw that, I was like, oh my god, it's using lints to figure out if it has to do something else as well. And I'm a person, even for polymorphism, I add explicit checks that a method or a struct should be implementing an interface. So every time you try to make changes to the interface, there'll be a lot of linting errors throughout my code base because I enforce those type assertions in my code. That's just the guy I do. I'm paranoid about type safety. And Cursor respects that. This brings an important point. AI is really stepping up. AI is really moving really fast and we need to keep up with it. The second feature we want to implement. So I am going to go in Git and I'm actually going to remove all these changes. But it was fun to see it implemented. That also pretty much in one shot. I mean, okay, maybe like an extra prompt, but it was pretty good. The second use case is going to be an interesting one. So one problem I have been having is that everything needs to be configured up front. So for example, whenever I'm using my model gateway, I have my backends pre-registered, right? And I have my models pre-registered as well. Sometimes I may not want to register a backend, but I might want to use a temporary backend. What I'm trying to say is, let's say there's a user, let's say we are building a SaaS app, okay? We're building a SaaS app, like we're building that AI chatbot, building Odin, and we want to give our users the ability to add their own API keys, okay? We might not want to store them in our model gateway, maybe because it would become a shared space, right? If you're storing all your keys in the model gateway and you're not taking care of security, you're storing all the keys in the same workspace, in the same database, and you might want some hard isolation between keys. You might not want to store them in the same place. You might want to store them separately. And that's like your application logic, right? So what's going to happen here is you would have some default models which you want to use. However, there could be some users which come with their own API keys. So you want your API gateway to use those dynamic backends instead using the pre-configured backend. So what if we could add the feature for dynamic backends? So I don't have to register a backend up front. Maybe through some headers or something like that, I can give like a base URL or like an API key for a new backend. And if I do that, the gateway should simply use that backend for whatever model I specified instead of using the existing backend. Does that make sense? So configuring backends on the fly. This is a big feature, guys. Like, think about it. Right now, what we have is we have an LLM object which gets a JSON object from the database, and based on the JSON object, it configures all the backends. Whenever it gets an OpenAI request for chat completion, it actually goes ahead and makes a call. We have a function which sees what model it is, and based on the model, what backend are we supposed to use? So essentially, this part right here, we need to get the backend not from the model's config, instead from like headers instead. So it's like a dynamic backend. We want to create a backend on the fly. Every model we have specifies which backend it's going to use, and then we have a corresponding backend there. But what I'm saying is, if I give you certain headers, then don't respect this backend. Instead, create a backend on the fly based on the header values. I mean, this is something which would require some architecture. I don't think it's that hard to implement this feature. It's going to be interesting on which approach you take to implement it. There are a lot of things you can do which are just flat out wrong. So, okay, let's go back to Composer. Sweet. Let's create a new chat. Is everything... Yeah, we're good. Yeah, remove the context. Very bad. Unless you know exactly what files are involved, don't use context, guys. Like, again, we used context earlier and we gave it a file which we thought was good. But what it ended up doing was Cursor used that file as context. It did not go ahead and use its brain that, hey, if I'm making changes in this file, there are some other files which will break as well. So if you're using this context, I think you need to add all the files. Yeah, you'll have to add all the files. But a good thing is you can always add folders straight up. So that's always an option for you. So how how do I even write the prompt for this? Okay, should I just leave it here or should I be specific? I think I should be specific. So instead of using the models backend, we want to use a dynamic backend. I want to keep it simple for now because I don't think so we should give it everything up front. So the thing is, there are multiple types of backends. So for example, there's an OpenAI compatible backend, there's Ollama backend. The way you talk to each backend is going to be different. So you need to have like a backend type or like a driver type, which lets this tool know which or how to talk to the backend. So even though we are exposing an OpenAI compatible API, not all backends will have an OpenAI compatible API as well. So we might want to do some kind of a conversion in the middle, right? So that thing has already been taken care of. We support 3 backends for now. So we just need to take the backend type, right? This is required. What's next? We'll also need, it feels like I'm architecting the solution for it. It almost feels like I'm architecting my solution for it, which is fine. I'm not scared of doing that. But I'm writing a lot of text here. Dynamic x inforex dynamic backend URL. We'll need the URL of the backend for sure. Like, how do we know where to connect this backend, right? Yeah, the backend config has this config thing. Now, this config could be different for every backend. So every backend would be like, hey, OpenAI requires an API key as well. Ollama doesn't need an API key, but both of them definitely need a base URL, right? So it's dynamic, and every backend will essentially use that config it gets to configure itself. Like Ollama uses the base URL. So we're just going to test with Ollama. We'll keep it simple. So this will be used to configure the base URL of the backend config object. Let's just start with this much. So we have a lot of APIs. You know what? Let's just implement it for one API first. Okay, cool. Not too bad. I guess this prompt is all right. I guess it's all right. Something we just came up with. Let's make sure we are an agent. We are. You know what? Let's hit submit. This would require changes in a lot of different places. I mean, I don't even know how it's going to go about doing it. This would take me some time to even like test it out and write it out. So I'm curious. I am really curious to see how it works. Okay, so it started. I'll help you implement this dynamic backend feature for OpenAI chat completion. Let me first search through the codebase to understand the current implementation. Sure, it searches. First, I'll modify the handle chat completion function. That's my handler for the chat completion. Function to check for dynamic backend headers. Okay, that's a great start. I really need to make sure my bindings come back. I think Vim mode is screwing it up. I can disable Vim mode and I think the bindings will start working. So what it did was it's first checking the headers. So it's getting the dynamic backend type and backend URL. That looks good. And then what is it? Create a dynamic backend. It's creating a backend right here. It should do it in the module. Because if I have 10 different APIs, I don't want this code to be in 10 different APIs, right? Oh, I can chat with this directly? Wait, you know what? Let's just go through it. Let's just see what it's doing. Let's not jump the gun too quickly. And then obviously it found some linting errors. And then it says that I noticed there are a couple of issues in the edit. Let me fix them. But where did it use this? So it goes ahead over here. And then, yeah, that's a lot of code changes, which I'm not sure. Like, why is it changing my function calling? Prepare the request. Okay. Everything looks good. It's just reformatting my code for some reason. I don't really understand. Whoa. I think it messed up. Dynamic backend. It was supposed to not create like an instance of the backend object. It was supposed to create an instance of the Ollama, TEI or that. Here it's trying to create an instance of the entire backend object, which might work. I mean, it might work, but I didn't do it outside though. Okay, so it's creating a new backend and then it's saying it's OpenAI. Wait, you're supposed to use OpenAI from here, buddy. The backend type comes from here. This is backend type. There are mistakes in this already. Let's just go ahead. It's made a lot of changes to my code for some reason, which I don't understand. But the main thing is here. If the dynamic backend was there, then call run streaming of the dynamic backend. Otherwise, call it off backends. This is a mistake. It shouldn't be doing this. And then what does it do? It gets the inference response. Say what? Oh, it's for streaming. Yeah, streaming and normal calling has been implemented separately. Okay, that's fair enough. They just changed one file, which makes sense. So you know what? Let's prompt it. We are already getting into territories where you need to have deep understanding of the code, guys. I don't expect any junior to be able to figure this out, because what's happening here is we have this backend struct, which is like a class which holds multiple backends as a map. So these backend is the dynamic thing which we want to create. Backends is like a wrapper on top of it, which implements some common functionality. For example, if you want to do like function calling with open source models, that's technically not possible. Not all backends support function calling for open source model. Ollama does, but some OpenAI like VLLM. I don't think VLLM does it. So the backends class implements that common functionality so that these these backends don't have to implement that, right? So I can add that function calling support to the backend's functionality instead of adding it to each backend individually, which makes life so much easier. So even the dynamic functions, we want this wrapper class to have that dynamic backend. So what it has to do is, instead of using a backend from this map, it should technically be creating a backend dynamically and use that instead. So that's what we want. That's what we want. Essentially, you know what? I need to disable Vim mode. I'm sorry, Vim. I'm sorry. I think a lot of people are going to boycott me once I do this, but Vim mode has to go because I can't work without these keys, guys. I just can't work without these keys. The key bindings are way more important than Vim. So what I do is, because every backend can speak their own API language, they have their own schema. I have created an intermediary schema. So like I have an intermediary schema, which is my own, which I can then convert to OpenAI or Olama and all these crazy people, right? Like Gemini or whatever. So I have a comment format. What it did was it updated my comment methods. So instead of like modifying the method signature or anything, it's like, you know what? You already have a place where you can provide inference options. So why not just edit things there dynamically? Again, originally inference options was places where the temperature settings and things like that would go in. If you're trying to modify the context length or the temperature or the top key and things like that, that's what goes in the options for the inference. So now we are adding a dynamic backend. That was a good decision. I did not think of that. I mean, now let me modify the OpenAI chat completion handler to pass the dynamic backend. All right, fair enough. It's generating the inference request. Again, I do this myself. And then you have options. Okay. If the header was present, and if this header was present as well, then you set these options. Not the best way to do it, nested ifs. I really don't like that piece of code, but you know what? We're gonna roll with it. It's fine. I mean, it just had to make this slight change. Why did it make so many changes in the code? Maybe my code was not well formatted, so it just formatted it a little bit better. Or it made my logic better. But I think it made a mistake. This was an important if. You shouldn't have removed that. You know what? It's fine. So here, what did it do? I think this is where the magic happens. Guys. Get model and backend. Bang on perfect. This is the function it should have changed. Now, what it's done is it's tried to get the backend. But why? If the dynamic config was provided, just do this first. Because the reason I'm giving you a dynamic backend is because this backend doesn't exist. You should have done this first, but that's fine. We can prompt it again. And then what does it do next? Config.backend object. And then, yep, it's creating this object. Oh, it gave it a dynamic ID as well. I like that. It made the config object, which is for the first iteration, we'll just give it a dynamic base URL. But yeah, we might have to add API keys and stuff like that dynamically too, which is, can live with it for now. And then it says dynamic backend. Okay, it's creating this. This is an interface. And then it's putting the switch case. And it's creating these dynamic objects by using this config, which is bang on perfect. This is how you would do it. And if there was an error, you return an error. Otherwise, you return this. Dude, this code is actually pretty good. One observation, cursor's code style, nested if loops, verbosity, doesn't seem that great in Golang. Not really. Nobody does nested if conditions. I mean, I don't do that. I've not seen projects which, I've worked on do that. I don't think so anybody does that. But I think its Python code is way cleaner, but it's likely seen more Python code in its training. So Python has a functional flair to it. You can use functional programming in Python, right? The lambdas and stuff like that. Go doesn't have that. Go has a very narrow set of keywords and a very narrow set of specifications. Go is verbose as a language, but you still don't have to do nested ifs. You know what? At this point, I would rather edit this myself than have Cursor do it. I'd rather just do this myself. I mean, do we really need an extra prompt for this? Because it looks great. I don't like certain aspects. Like, I don't like the fact that it's doing this if statement again, because we're doing this if statement in another place anyways. I think we're doing it right here, but here we are appending it to a map. So I see why I did it again, but that could be another prompt where we go like, hey, we're doing this switch case on the backend tab in two places. Can you just make it happen in one place instead? So, okay, let's just go through the code. And of course, I'll have to go through it manually. I really don't understand why it made so many changes here. Okay, you know what? Let's just read it. If I got tools in the request, then tool selection is tool. Fair enough. And then what I do is I add a tool and the tool type is set to function. Why did you remove this code? Because that's the only tool type available. Fair enough. Oh, Cursor is smart. It's removing redundant pieces of code. You know what? I like to be explicit. I'm going to put it back in. I'm sorry. I'm just going to put it back in. Okay, that's fine. Tool selection is none, so it replaced that with an else if. I think that's a cleaner way to do it. Sure. It's making my code a little bit better. And it renamed my function because this function was, I think it was getting too much. So it just, better naming conventions. I'll buy that. It's taking the function and it's pretty much the same code, but it just renamed the variable name and it's added some comment. Thank you so much. I like it. I like its code code better than mine. But again, don't remove this tooltip for me, man. Vim is misbehaving. But okay, then it prepared a request. So this is where I was preparing the request, just passing in the model, messages, and tools. So it's done the same thing, but I don't know, just redid it. And then it's preparing the options as well, which I did right here. And you know what? I had a function to take care of new inference options. Why did it not use that? Why did I even have that function? Oh, it was setting the default values for the driver. We need to set those default values, bud. You're just forgetting to do that. Why are you changing my code? I think this code was better because this is also changing some, it's also changing some internal thing. Yeah, I think I want to take my code instead because like I said, we need to make sure that some things are done by default. Number of contexts, that's essentially the max tokens, and then temperature is temperature. And you know what I'll do is I will remove this. I really don't like this. I mean, it's fine. We'll change it in the next one. And then it's using, okay, cool. It doesn't like the variable syntax apparently. I'm gonna let that slide. Adding some comments. You know what? It looks good. I like this. I'm gonna accept changes here. So that's done. Now the other inference. What are the changes it made here? So it added this. I already love this change. I think it added the types to the right place. And then finally the helpers. Again, I think the dynamic options should be checked out first, which we already did. I don't like the double switch cases, but I think that could be in a separate composer prompt altogether. I don't want to fuss about it too much and get the perfect code in just one sitting. I think we can have multiple prompts. Like I can note it down that, hey, I need to fix this somewhere. And then I can just have another composer thing do that. You know what? I'm going to accept this. It looks good to me. Now, how do we test it? Can we ask Composer to see if it can help us test it? You know what? I'm just gonna stage these commits so that if it makes any more changes, we can reject that. The way we can test it is by removing backends from the database. Then I have like a helper utility which can kind of do that. So what I'm gonna do is I already have like an Olama backend, right? I'm gonna misconfigure it. Okay, the code builds, that's good. But essentially what's gonna happen is if somebody tries to do a chat completion now, it won't work. So the backend in the database is wrong and I'm going to put in a 4. Now, if this works, what that technically means is like it dynamically created a backend and not use the default config because the default config fails, remember? Oh my God, I want to see if this works. It's taking time. I think that's a good sign. Maybe the info. Guys, I don't believe this. It actually worked. It took a couple of tries. It took a little bit of editing. It took a little bit of time of even reviewing code. But I call that a big W. I call that a massive W. Oh my God, that was amazing. But I just kept going because Cursor is so cool. Just cannot believe it that it actually wrote the code and it figured it out. Again, the changes were not that massive, but again, the code base is fairly complex. Navigating that code and figuring out what needs to change where, that's tricky. These are not tasks I could have delegated to somebody just onboarding onto the project that easy. And the fact that I could just get it done in like 15-20 minutes, that's really good. I mean, I know I can code these things in. Maybe coding would take me like 30 minutes, maybe a little bit more, but coding always adds a little bit of effort and adds a little bit of exhaustion. And you can't keep up with coding a lot of new features in one single day. But if I have a tool like Cursor, which can implement things in a way that I don't have to like think about the code, I just have to think about the architecture on where the code needs to be, and it writes the code for me, it will definitely increase my productivity. You know what? This requires a long-term test. I think I'm going to use this for a while. And maybe in a year or something, maybe 6 months, we could have a check-in just to see if it's going to be good. Like, share, and subscribe if you found this video to be helpful. And don't forget, I am your tech bud. You're on YouTube and hopefully in real life.